The letter was postmarked 3 weeks before I even opened it. I'd shoved it under a stack of overdue electric bills. Figured it was junk, something from a law firm fishing for clients. But the envelope had weight to it. Real weight. The kind that sits on a pile and somehow rises to the top every morning, no matter how many times you push it back down. I remember exactly where I was standing. Kitchen, 8 in the morning, coffee going cold on the counter, still in my boots from the night shift at the garage. My hands smelled like motor oil and WD-40. I tore it open over the sink. Dear Mr. Cole Briggs, it is our duty to inform you that your great-uncle, Harold Dean Briggs, passed on the 14th of last month. He has named you sole heir to his estate, the Dustwood Ranch, located outside Calico Springs, Texas. The property consists of 340 acres, one main house, 2 outbuildings, and a well. Per Mr. Briggs' instruction, immediate occupancy is encouraged. There is a matter of urgency regarding current residents of the property. Current residents. I read that part twice, then 3 times. I didn't know I had a great-uncle named Harold. My father never talked about his side of the family. Far as I knew, there was no family. Just me, a rented apartment in Amarillo, 2 bad knees from a football injury in 2009, and a 2004 Ford pickup that burned oil. I called the law firm. A woman named Margaret answered and spoke with the careful patience of someone who had already explained something complicated several times. She said, Mr. Briggs, there are currently 7 women living on the property. I said, 7. She said, they are all widows. They were, each of them, wives of men who worked the ranch for your great-uncle over the last 4 decades. Great-uncle allowed them to remain after their husbands passed. He considered it his obligation, I said. How old are we talking? A pause. Then, the youngest is 51, the oldest is 83. I didn't say anything. Mr. Briggs, there is one more thing. Another pause. Longer this time. Each of them has a photograph of you. The drive down, I left Amarillo on a Tuesday. I want to tell you the drive was scenic. All red rocks and big sky and lone hawks on telephone wires. And it was some of that. But mostly it was me with the window cracked. Radio stuck between a country station and static, running the same loop in my head. Why did 7 women I'd never met have a photograph of me? I was 34 years old. I wasn't famous. I fixed transmissions for a living. I'd been engaged once, briefly 4 years back, and that ended the way those things end when one person wants to stay planted and the other one wants to keep moving. No kids, no real enemies, no mystery. But there was a photograph. 7 of them. I stopped for gas outside a town called Vado and bought a bag of sunflower seeds and stood beside my truck and thought about turning around. Thought about it seriously. Kind of. Thinking where you actually picture yourself doing it. Signaling left. Pulling back onto the highway north. Watching that exit disappear in the rear view. But I kept going. I think I kept going because the part of me that fixes things, and I am genuinely, fundamentally a person who fixes things. It's not just a job, it's a reflex. Couldn't leave something broken without at least looking at it first. Dustwood Ranch was at the end of a Kalish road off Route 9. Past a cattle guard, past a broken mailbox someone had tied back together with baling wire. The main house was white once, probably, now more the color of old paper. 2 live oaks in the front yard. A wooden porch with a swing that needed new rope. I pulled up and sat in the truck for a moment. Before I could reach for the door handle, the front door opened. And there she was. I don't know what I expected. I think I expected someone who looked hard, the way ranch life makes people hard. Weathered and guarded, arms crossed, watching me the way a landowner watches a stranger, pulling up uninvited. She was none of that. She was maybe 60, small-framed, dark hair gone silver at the soles, wearing jeans and a blue chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows. She stood atop of the porch steps with her hands in her back pockets, and she looked at me the way you look at someone you've been expecting, not surprised, not wary, but with something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. You're Cole, she said. Not a question. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Delia.
She came down 2 steps. Harold talked about you. Your whole life he kept tabs. Sent someone every few years to take a picture. She stopped. He never reached out because he was afraid you'd think he was strange. An old man claiming family he'd never introduced himself to. He figured it was better to just watch from a distance. Make sure you were all right. I stood there with my truck keys in my hand. He left you everything, she said. And he left us here because he didn't know what else to do for us. He was hoping you'd figure it out. The 7, I met them all that first evening around a table the size of a small continent, solid pine, in a kitchen that smelled like cornbread and coffee and something slow-cooked. Delia made the introductions. She was organized about it. Matter of fact, the way a person is when they've already thought through the awkward parts and decided to just move through them. There was Ruth, who was 83, and sat at the head of the table like it was her natural position, which apparently it was. She had been on that ranch for 41 years. Her husband, Frank, had been the foreman. She had outlived him by 16 years and had outlived Harold by 3 weeks. And she looked like she intended to outlive everyone at that table, just pure stubbornness. When I shook her hand, she held it a moment longer than I expected and looked at me directly. You have his eyes, she said. Whose? Your grandfather's. Harold's brother. Same set. She released my hand. Sit down. You're making me nervous standing there. There was June, who was 68 and had a loud laugh and had apparently been the one managing the ranch's practical business for the last several years since Harold's health declined. She slid a folder across the table to me before we'd even gotten to the food. Inside were 3 years of accounts, neat and organized, handwritten in blue pen. I balanced that every month, she said. Harold couldn't see good enough to do it himself and didn't trust anyone in town. Said numbers were private. There was Esther, 74, barely spoke at dinner, but who had, I later learned, kept the kitchen garden running. The one behind the house that provided most of their vegetables. She watched me the whole meal with the careful attention of someone deciding something. There was Vera, 59, who had arrived on the ranch the most recently, just 8 years ago, when her husband came to work there already sick. He lasted 2 years. She stayed. She had the kind of manner that tells you she's been through things, and came out the other side still standing but changed by the passage. There was Loretta, 63, who had grown up on a ranch herself, 1 county over, and seemed the most comfortable with the work, the land, the machinery. During dinner she told me, unprompted, which fence lines needed repair, which section of pasture was running dry, and which of the 2 outbuildings had a roof problem that would become a crisis before Christmas. There was Patsy, 71, quiet and steady, who had been Harold's closest companion in his last years. Not romantically, she made a point of saying, in the way old people sometimes are companions, sitting on the porch, watching the weather come in, not always talking. And there was Delia, who had poured my coffee without asking how I took it, and somehow gotten it right, who answered questions before I could finish forming them, who had left 3 yellow sticky notes on the kitchen counter about things I'd need to address in the first week. Water, pump, property tax filing. A creditor Harold had owed for 2 years and ignored. I looked around that table and I had the strangest feeling. Not the feeling you'd expect. Not discomfort. Not the pressure of obligation. Something else. The feeling of a room that was already running, already functional, already full of the kind of quiet order that comes from years of people figuring out how to live together with dignity. They didn't need saving. They never did. The first month I slept in the back bedroom, the one that had apparently been kept for guests and never used. And I lay awake that first night, looking at the ceiling and listening to the house. Old houses make noise. They breathe. This one had a particular creak at the top of the stairs that happened every time the temperature dropped, which in Texas in the fall is sometime after midnight. It had a loose shutter on the east side that tapped in the wind with a slow, irregular rhythm. Ch. It had the distant sound of the generator that kept the well pump running, a low hum you stopped hearing after a while, the way you stop hearing highway sound when you live near a highway. I fixed the shutter the second morning. Not because anyone asked. I just heard it, and I knew what to do with it. June watched me from the porch, coffee in hand. Harold lived with that shutter for 6 years, she said. Why? Said he liked the sound. Said it reminded him something was loose somewhere, kept him from getting too comfortable, she considered. I think mostly he just didn't like getting on a ladder. I laughed for the first time since I'd arrived. The ranch work was real, and it was constant, and I hadn't been on a working ranch since I was 11 years old when my father took a brief job in the Panhandle and brought off for a cop summer that ended badly when he left the job and me briefly behind. Enough. Muscle memory is a strange thing. The way your body knows to move around large animals, the way your hands figure out fencing before your mind catches up. Loretta worked beside me most mornings that first week, not instructing exactly, more just being there, doing the adjacent task, available if I looked like I was going to do something wrong. She never said, "Don't do it that way." She just somehow appeared on the correct side of whatever I was doing, modeling the alternative. On the 5th day, I said, "You could just tell me," she said. Telling people usually makes them defensive. I thought about that for a long moment. That's fair. Delia. I need to tell you about Delia. Not the way you're probably expecting. Not the way stories go, where the man arrives, and the woman is there, and the story is about him figuring out he loves her. That's too simple, and it's not what happened. What happened is more like, I came to understand her the way you come to understand a place. Slowly, in layers, by paying attention. She had been on Dustwood for 22 years. Her husband, a man named Thomas, had managed the horses. Thomas had died of a heart attack in the Far East pasture on a Tuesday morning in April 11 years ago. Delia found him 2 hours later. She didn't leave. I thought about it, she told me once. We were on the porch, late enough in October that the evenings had turned cool, and she had a blanket across her lap. I thought about it for about 4 months. I had a sister in Phoenix. I had options. She looked out at the dark tree line. But this is where I know how to be. This is where I know the sounds and what they mean and what needs doing. A pause. Does that make sense? Yeah, I said. It does. And it did. 'Cause I'd been in Amarillo for 6 years, and I hadn't known the sounds, and I hadn't known what needed doing, and I had floated there the way a person can float in a life that fits well enough, but doesn't fit exactly. Like a boot that's almost the right size. You can walk in it all day, but at the end of the day your foot is tired in specific places. Delia wasn't warm in the effortless way some people are warm, the way that can sometimes be a mask for not wanting to really see you. She was warm. In the way that comes from choosing to engage, deciding you were worth paying attention to. She remembered the things. Not in an overwhelming way, not in the way that makes you feel surveilled. She remembered because she listened. One morning in early November, I came into the kitchen at 6 in the morning, groggy, and there was coffee waiting, and beside the mug a small glass of orange juice, which I had mentioned offhandedly 3 weeks earlier, that I liked in the mornings when I was a kid. I stood there looking at that orange juice for a moment. Then I sat down and drank it. The thing about the photograph, I found out the whole story of the photographs in pieces. Ruth told me the first piece. Harold had gone looking for his brother's son. My grandfather's son. My father. When my grandfather died and my father was 17. Harold was only 22. Himself, and the family had scattered after their parents passed young, and Harold was the oldest and he tried to hold it together and failed. Because you can't hold together people who've decided not to be held. He found my father eventually. My father was already running by then, already in the first of what would be many leaving moods. Harold made contact once. My father didn't respond. Patsy told me the second piece. Harold never gave up on the idea of family. It was a wound for him. He just redirected it. He built a family here, on this land, with these people. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't blood, but it was real. June told me the third piece. When my father died, 7 years ago, and I knew this, I was there. A small service in a funeral home in Lubbock, me and a woman from the VA and the director. Harold found out. He hired someone to find me. He got the photograph. And after that, every 2 years, another one. Delia told me the last piece. She said, he felt guilty for not reaching out sooner. He talked about it the last 2 years, a lot. He'd say, that boy is alone up there. And I let it go too long, and I'd say, then call him. And he'd say he was afraid. Afraid you'd resent him. Afraid you'd think he was a stranger, which technically he was. She folded her hands in her lap. He died thinking he'd waited too long. I looked at her for a long time. He didn't, I said finally, and I meant it, not as comfort, as a fact, because I was sitting on that porch, in those hills, and the air smelled like cedar and cold night coming, and somewhere in the east pasture, one of the horses was moving in the dark, and this house was full of people who'd made a life out of staying, and I was, for the first time in a long time, not floating. What it became, I stayed. I want to be clear about what that cost and what it was worth. What it cost, the apartment in Amarillo, which was easy. The garage job, which was less easy. Because I'd been there 3 years. And the owner was a decent man who'd worked with my schedule and given me Thanksgiving off, without complaint. I called him and explained, and he said, well, son, you only get one ranch in a lifetime, and that was that. What it was worth, that's harder to say in a list. It was worth waking up knowing what needed doing. It was worth Loretta showing me how to read weather by the behavior of the cattle. It was worth Ruth's Tuesday dinners, where she made biscuits from memory, and told stories about Frank that were sometimes funny and sometimes full of grief and always honest. It was worth Esther, who eventually started talking, slowly, carefully, like someone relearning a language, and who turned out to have opinions about everything, and a sharp, dry humor she'd been keeping very close to her. It was worth June's competence and her folder of neat numbers and her ability to laugh loudly in the middle of the day at nothing in particular. It was worth Vera's steadiness, which was a kind of courage I'd seen before, but rarely acknowledged for what it was. The courage of continuing. It was worth Patsy's quiet and what it taught me about sitting with someone in silence, without either of you needing to fill it, and it was worth Delia. Delia, what I need to say. In February I fixed the kitchen faucet, the one with the slow drip she'd been ignoring, and she stood in the doorway watching, and afterward she said, you didn't have to do that, and I said, I know, and she said, you're going to turn out to be a good man. And something about the way she said it, not as a compliment, not as flattery, but as an observation, a careful assessment from someone who didn't hand those out casually, hit me somewhere important. I'm not built for big declarations. I never have been. The engagement I mentioned, the one that ended, part of why it ended was that I couldn't give the declarations she needed, and I couldn't pretend to be someone who gave them. It wasn't coldness. It was just that the big moments always felt somehow false to me, like they were performing the emotion rather than being it. But in March, when the night was warm for the first time, and we were sitting on the porch after dinner, and everyone else had gone in, I said to Delia, I don't think I was doing anything real before I came here. She didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at the stars. Then she said, doing something real now. I reached over and took her hand. She let me hold it, and that was the whole of it. That was the declaration. 2 people on a porch in the dark, holding on. Epilogue. Ruth turned 84 in April. We had a dinner that lasted 4 hours. Esther's kitchen garden produced more tomatoes that summer than any of us could eat, and she started selling them from a card table at the end of the road on Saturday mornings, and appeared to enjoy it enormously. June found a creditor I hadn't known about, and dealt with them entirely on her own, before telling me, because, as she explained, you had enough on your plate. And it was a small matter. and I knew how to handle it. Psst. Loretta trained me on the far pasture fence repair, and later said I was a quick study, Trees, which from Loretta is approximately equivalent to anyone else saying, "You've achieved something remarkable." Vera planted a rose bush near the east porch. She didn't explain it, and no one asked. Patsy and I still sit on the porch sometimes, in the evenings, not talking. It's my favorite kind of time. The photograph, the last one Harold had taken of me, standing beside my truck outside the garage in Amarillo, squinting into the sun. Delia had it in a frame on the kitchen windowsill. I asked her once why she kept it up there. Now that I was, actually here. She looked at it for a moment. "Because he loved you before he knew you," she said. And I think that's worth remembering. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The shutter on the east side is still a little loose. I leave it that way now. Some sounds are worth keeping.